Greetings, friends. Why did the American Revolution happen? The American colonists weren't taxed very much. They were taxed far more in Britain, like 20 times more than what they would have been taxed in the colonies back in the 18th century before the Civil War began, because it was a civil war. I mean, it was a revolution too, as we'll see. It was revolutionary it tried to change certain fundamental structures in society, like getting rid of the concept of monarchy would be one of those ideas. But it was not a popular war at the beginning because there wasn't that big pressure. I mean, again, they say history is written by the victors, and the victors are going to make the British out to be these big, like, tyrants, and you're going to have Mel Gibson's movie The Patriot depicting the British in a completely ridiculous way. I mean, I know that movie was like, almost 20 years old now. The Loyalists were a large proportion of the American colonists. Only, from what I understand, only about 1 in 5 of the American colonists would have supported the, breaking away from Great Britain at the beginning of the conflict. And then as the conflict dragged on, maybe the colonists did get more and more support. But there were always a lot of loyalists. And actually, the foundation of English Canada, or Upper Canada, or Ontario as it is today, that foundation was loyalists who came from the United States to settle here and found the new town, the new capital at York. And of course, there were a lot of late loyalists, so-called, who came just for the land, and they didn't have to pay too much money for the land because the British wanted to settle it, and they'd be willing to swear an oath of allegiance to King George. And of course, Canada became a liberal hellhole like it is today, whereas America is still more conservative than Canada. It depends on in what regard, but so you can make fun of Canada that way. But we really did have a conservative beginning in English Canada, and you can even point to French Canada as being like, well, that was Catholic and that was French, and that's in a way even more conservative in trying to preserve its culture and its way of life. The American Revolution was founded by, or was encouraged and financed and driven and encouraged by merchants. They had to get Morris? They had at least one big banker that got in to fund them, because the merchants were based on the seaboard in places like in the Northeast, in Boston, and they were very influential, and they wanted to make more money. They wanted to have more freedom. That was the American ideal: more freedom, more land, more trade, more commerce. And the British were actually the ones restraining the American colonists from moving farther westward into the Indian nations. They were actually trying to work with the natives in a way where, okay, we'll guarantee your domain here, basically on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, I'm not saying maybe that was realistic to expect that they would have been able to hold back the colonists forever. Probably not, but I am trying to highlight the land-hungry, freedom-loving spirit that was there, because there's a lot of money to be made in America, and the merchants, they don't want to be under the yoke of the British. And that impetus in the American Revolution is similar in the French Revolution, which occurred less than 20 years later in France. And what do we have in France? It's the bourgeois. It's the uprising, the upcoming middle class, which is stirring up the masses. And you can say there's the Freemasons, there's the Jesuits, okay, but I mean, from one standpoint, it really is, it's a bourgeois impetus in the French Revolution, which I think more of you could agree was not a good thing if you're a right-wing person. But then why is the American Revolution a great thing? No, it's not one or the other. They're both connected. In fact, the French were supporting the American Revolution. And so there's a connection in Enlightenment ideals. There's even a financial connection between France and America of the 18th century, and it's being crucial in bringing us into this modern world. So I want to remind you that you have to go back further in time. You got to really question some of the foundations of the world we live in. It's not necessarily freedom and the American Revolution being a good foundation, because that was actually revolutionary. They could have at least made George Washington a king, but they didn't. They just made him a president. So it's not, the mystique is not there. The prerogative of having a legacy as a monarch is not there. You're in office for 4 years or 8 years, and then you're gone. You're not really accountable to the people in the same way. They try to get rid of the idea of nobility and aristocracy, and I believe Alexander Hamilton was wise enough to try and preserve an idea of aristocracy, but the other founding fathers, they didn't agree with him. But the founding fathers, by the way, they didn't like the idea of democracy, so I can agree with them on that. They thought democracy was 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for dinner. So you can tell what's going to happen. So they weren't stupid, but they were unleashing Pandora's box. And it just took a number of generations, but not too many generations, before the consequences came home to roost. And that was mass democracy, expanding the franchise to everyone. It was baked into the cake from the beginning. And there's no perfect answer, obviously, because you can have a different society where things go awry. Like, look at Russia. It was a very conservative culture, and it all got turned upside down too by the Bolsheviks and whoever was financing them. But it often is the money power. It often is the people championing freedom that end up continuing the revolutionary spirit. We must reject revolution. Revolution is not just political. Revolution is cultural. Revolution is spiritual. It's an ongoing spiritual battle. You have God at the top. You have the king. You have the nobility. You have the people below them. You have man, woman, children, animals, hierarchy. Revolution wants to upturn all of that. Hasta luego, amigos.